My own family. My husband, my children. They looked me in the eyes and called me a fraud. Said the pain that crippled me was just a performance, an act for attention. For years, their disbelief was a slow poison, eating away at my life. But what they didn't know, what no one could imagine, was that the truth was about to collapse right in front of them. Before the whispers started, before the doubt clouded my family's eyes, my life felt like a well-tended garden. I was Brenda Miller, just past 50, a recently retired primary school teacher. The days stretched before me, full of promise. I envisioned lazy afternoons spent with my hands in the soil, coaxing roses to bloom, and lively evenings with my husband, Richard. We'd built a good life in our comfortable suburban home, a place filled with the echoes of our children, Jessica and Tom, growing up. They were adults now, with their own burgeoning lives, but still the center of my world. I'd always been the anchor, the one who remembered birthdays, organized family gatherings, the one whose kitchen always smelled of something baking, usually for a local charity event or just because. My reputation in our little Midwestern town was that of a doer, an energetic woman always ready with a smile and a helping hand. That was the Brenda everyone knew. That was the Brenda I knew. The first tendrils of what was to come were insidious, easy to dismiss. A persistent fatigue that clung to me like a damp cloak, no matter how much I rested. Aches in my joints that I initially chalked up to getting older, to years of bending over little desks. I tried to push through it, to maintain that energetic facade, because that's what everyone expected of me, what I expected of myself. But slowly, the garden of my life began to show signs of blight. I started declining invitations, my baking became less frequent, and the walks Richard and I used to enjoy became shorter, then non-existent. I could see the subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of impatience when I'd say I was too tired for an outing, or when I'd wince trying to lift something. The day the ground truly fell away beneath me, however, wasn't marked by a dramatic event, but by quiet, devastating words spoken in the supposed sanctuary of our own living room. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that used to be filled with comfortable chatter. Richard sat opposite me, his expression uncharacteristically grave. Jessica was there too, perched on the arm of the sofa, her arms crossed, a mirror of her father's solemnity. Even Tom, usually more laid back, seemed tense, avoiding my gaze. My heart began a slow, nervous thrum. I had no idea what was coming. Richard cleared his throat, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. He said, "Brenda, we need to talk about this constant illness of yours." His voice, usually a comfort, was laced with an unfamiliar edge. I looked at him, confused. This constant illness? I was simply telling them how I felt, trying to make them understand the invisible battle raging within me. Jessica chimed in then, her tone sharp. She said, "Mom, you're always sick when there's something important going on, or whenever I ask if you can watch the kids for a couple of hours. It feels like you're doing it for attention to attention." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. My breath hitched. I stared at them, my daughter, my husband. Was this a cruel joke? Their faces were serious, etched with a kind of weary conviction. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but the words caught in my throat, choked by a sudden, overwhelming wave of disbelief and a pain so profound it felt like a physical blow. My energetic life, my community involvement, my love for them, did none of that count against this monstrous accusation? Tom, bless his usually gentle heart, finally spoke, though he still couldn't look at me directly. He mumbled, "Mom, we're just worried this is becoming a habit. Maybe if you just tried a little harder." Tried harder. I was trying with every fiber of my being just to get through each day, to smile through the fog of pain and exhaustion. For them to suggest it was a lack of effort, a ploy for sympathy, was like a knife twisting in an already open wound. I remember looking from one face to another, searching for a flicker of doubt in their eyes, a sign that they didn't truly believe what they were saying. But all I saw was a united front of accusation, a shared narrative they had clearly discussed and agreed upon. The people I loved most in the world, the people I would have laid down my life for, were essentially calling me a liar, a manipulator. The shock was so immense, it left me numb, unable to articulate the storm of hurt and betrayal raging inside me. In that moment, the foundation of my world didn't just crack, it shattered. The woman known for her energy and helpfulness was, in the eyes of her own family, a fraud. The loving wife and mother was now a hypochondriac, a performer of phantom ailments. The carefully tended garden of my life was suddenly overrun, not by a physical disease alone, but by the far more corrosive blight of their disbelief. The weight of their judgment was immediate and crushing, stealing the very air from my lungs. How could they think such a thing? Had they forgotten all the years I'd been there for them, tirelessly, joyfully? Did the sudden onset of my symptoms, so real and terrifying to me, genuinely seem like a calculated bid for the spotlight in their eyes? The questions swirled, but no answers came, only the cold, hard reality of their shared verdict. I was no longer Brenda, the capable and caring woman. I was Brenda, the attention seeker. The silence that followed their pronouncements was deafening, filled only with the sound of my own heart breaking. I felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of their misunderstanding. The vibrant colors of my world seemed to leach away, leaving behind a stark, gray landscape of despair. This was just the beginning, I sensed, the first devastating blow in a battle I didn't even know how to fight, because the enemy wasn't just an illness, but the people I loved. Their words, spoken with such conviction, began to plant poisonous seeds of doubt even in my own mind. Was I exaggerating? Was I somehow bringing this on myself? The insidious nature of their accusation was that it made me question my own sanity, my own perception of reality. That, perhaps, was the most devastating impact of all in those initial moments. The vibrant, confident woman I had been just hours before felt like a distant memory, a ghost. In her place sat someone small, wounded, and utterly bewildered. The carefully constructed narrative of my life had been torn apart, and I was left clutching the shredded pieces, with no idea how, or if, I could ever put them back together. The journey ahead looked impossibly dark, and the weight of their judgment felt like an anchor, dragging me down into an abyss of pain and confusion. Little did I know then just how deep that abyss would become, or what it would take to finally claw my way back to the light, and to the truth they so cruelly denied. The pain they inflicted that day was a prelude, a grim overture to a symphony of suffering they would conduct. But even in that initial shock, a tiny, bruised ember of defiance began to glow. They had wounded me, yes, perhaps mortally, but a part of me, buried deep, refused to be extinguished entirely. The story was far from over. If you've ever felt the sting of disbelief from those you hold dear, or the crushing weight of an unfair judgment, you know a fraction of what I began to endure. Stick with me through this journey, and if you feel moved, perhaps subscribe or give this video a like. I'd also love to know, in the comments, what city or town you're listening from today, as I share this piece of my life with you. What happened next would test me beyond anything I could have ever imagined. The accusation, once spoken, didn't just hang in the air, it seeped into the very fabric of our home, tainting everything. It was in the way Richard would sigh with exaggerated patience when I moved slowly in the morning, his eyes following me with a new, critical assessment. It was in Jessica's increasingly infrequent calls, and when she did phone, her voice was brittle, her questions about my health cursory, as if ticking off a box before moving on to her own needs. Tom, dear Tom, tried to be kind in his way, but even his kindness was now tinged with a sort of pitying skepticism, the kind you reserve for someone you believe is fundamentally deluded. The comfortable rhythm of our family life was replaced by a strained, awkward dance around the elephant in the room, my supposed attention-seeking illness. My world, once expansive and full of connections, began to shrink with alarming speed. Doctor's appointments became exercises in humiliation. Richard, when he bothered to accompany me, would often subtly undermine my descriptions of pain or fatigue. He'd say to the doctor, with a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, "She's been under a lot of stress," or, "She tends to worry." The doctors, already pressed for time and often dealing with ambiguous symptoms, would latch onto these cues. I saw their expression shift from concern to polite dismissal. Tests were often cursory, referrals slow to come, if they came at all. It was as if my family's disbelief created an invisible barrier, preventing any real investigation into my suffering. The isolation wasn't just medical, it was social too. Friends I'd known for years, women I'd shared laughter and tears with, started to drift away. I'd hear snippets of conversations, relayed by my sister Linda, who still believed me, about how Brenda wasn't herself anymore, or how Richard was having such a hard time with her dramatics. The invitations to coffee mornings, book club meetings, and community events dwindled, then stopped altogether. It seemed my family's narrative had been more compelling, more easily digested, than the messy, uncomfortable truth of an unexplained illness. I became a recluse, not by choice, but by a slow, painful ostracization. The house itself, once a place of comfort and security, began to feel like a gilded cage. I spent more and more time in our bedroom, the four walls a silent witness to my deteriorating physical state and my equally crumbling emotional well-being. The ache in my joints intensified, the fatigue became a leaden weight I carried constantly. Some days, just getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. And through it all, the unspoken accusation was my constant companion: "You're faking this. You're doing this to yourself." One evening, I was lying in bed, the door slightly ajar, when I overheard Richard on the phone in the hallway. He was speaking to his brother, David. His voice was low, but the words carried clearly. He said, "Yeah, she's sick again today. Honestly, Dave, I think it's all in her head. She just needs the drama." His casual dismissal, the weariness in his tone as if I were an inconvenient burden he was forced to bear, cut deeper than any outright confrontation could have. He wasn't just saying these things to my face anymore, this was his truth, shared with others, cementing my role as the family fraud. I pulled the covers tighter, a cold dread seeping into my bones. My own husband. My attempts to explain the nuances of my symptoms, the strange constellation of feelings that didn't fit any neat diagnostic box I knew of, were met with increasing impatience. Jessica would roll her eyes, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a slap. Tom would fidget and change the subject. Richard would simply walk away, as if my words were an annoyance he no longer had the energy to entertain. Their disbelief was a wall, impenetrable and chilling. I started to speak less, to share less, retreating into a silent world of my own pain, because what was the point? They had already decided who I was, what I was doing. The vibrant woman who loved to bake, to garden, to engage with her community, was fading. In her place was a shadow, haunted by pain and a profound loneliness that gnawed at my soul. My self-worth, once a sturdy oak, was being whittled away, leaving me feeling like a hollowed-out shell. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the pain was at its worst and sleep was a distant memory, I would stare at my reflection and wonder if they were right. Was I imagining it? Was I so desperate for something, for some acknowledgement, that I had manufactured this elaborate charade? The power of their conviction was terrifyingly persuasive. The loss of their belief was a constant, dull ache, a grief that settled deep within me. This wasn't just about being sick, it was about being seen, being heard, being believed by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. And in that, they had failed me utterly. The weight of their judgment was far heavier than the physical symptoms, because it attacked the very core of who I was. It made me question not just my body, but my mind, my character. Our home, once filled with laughter and warmth, became a place of unspoken tensions and silent recriminations. Meals were eaten in near silence, the air thick with things unsaid. The casual affection, the easy camaraderie that had defined our family, evaporated, replaced by a careful, distant politeness that was almost more painful than open hostility. I was an island in my own home, surrounded by a sea of polite indifference. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of pain, fatigue, and the crushing weight of being disbelieved. My garden, untended, grew wild, a poignant metaphor for my own neglected state. The roses I had so lovingly cultivated drooped, their vibrant colors fading, much like the joy in my own life. Each withered bloom felt like another small piece of me dying. I learned to wear a mask, a carefully constructed facade of stoicism, because showing my pain only seemed to reinforce their narrative of me being overly dramatic. But beneath the mask, I was unraveling. The isolation was profound, the despair a constant companion. It felt as if I were slowly disappearing, a ghost in my own life, unseen, unheard, unacknowledged. The injustice of it all burned within me, a slow, simmering fire. How could they, who knew me so well, or so I thought, believe such a monstrous thing? What had I ever done to deserve such callous disbelief? These questions haunted my waking hours and invaded my troubled sleep. The descent into this lonely, private hell was gradual but relentless, and at its nadir, I truly wondered if I would ever find my way back. The Brenda they had accused me of being was a stranger to me, yet she was the only Brenda they seemed to see. And the real me, the one suffering silently, was fading into oblivion, one disbelieving glance at a time. Months, perhaps even a full year, bled into this miserable landscape of disbelief and failing health. I had largely given up trying to convince my family, or even the doctors who now saw me as a case of medically unexplained symptoms, which felt like a polite term for it's all in your head. My energy was a precious, dwindling resource, and I hoarded it for the simple act of existing. Yet, even in the deepest fog of despair, a tiny, stubborn spark of self-preservation, of knowing my own body, refused to be completely extinguished. It was this spark that led me, late one night, down a rabbit hole of online medical forums. Sleep was a fickle friend, and the quiet hum of the computer was less oppressive than the silence of my own thoughts. I typed in my most persistent symptoms: the crushing fatigue, the joint pain that migrated and burned, the strange tightening sensation in my skin, the brain fog that made even simple tasks feel monumental. Page after page of generic advice appeared. Then, tucked away in a less frequented corner of the internet, I found it, a forum specifically for individuals with rare autoimmune diseases. As I began to read the posts, a shiver went down my spine, a feeling distinct from my usual chills. The descriptions weren't just similar to mine, they were mirror images. People spoke of the same invisible torments, the same dismissals from doctors, the same erosion of their lives and relationships. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I didn't feel entirely alone. One particular thread caught my eye. It detailed a condition I'd never heard of, something with a complex, multisyllabic name. The list of potential symptoms, the way it could wax and wane, the difficulty in diagnosing it, it all resonated with an unnerving accuracy. I scrolled for hours, a knot of something akin to fearful hope tightening in my chest. Could this be it? Could there be a name, a real, verifiable name, for the beast that was slowly consuming me? The possibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. Then, a fragmented memory surfaced, like a piece of driftwood tossed onto the shore of my consciousness. Years ago, before the symptoms had become truly debilitating, before the family's accusations had taken root, I'd seen a rheumatologist for some initial, milder joint pain. He'd run a battery of tests. Most came back normal, but I vaguely recalled him mentioning something offhand, a vague autoimmune marker in my blood work. At the time, he'd said it was probably nothing to worry about, that it could be a statistical blip. We hadn't pursued it further. I had been busy, still relatively healthy, and the warning hadn't seemed urgent. Now, that forgotten comment blazed in my mind with a new, urgent significance. This faint glimmer of a possibility, this connection between the forum and that old, dismissed blood test, was the first crack of light in my oppressive darkness. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was something. It was a direction. For so long, I had been adrift, with no map, no compass. Now, a faint star seemed to flicker in the distance. The next morning, I felt a sliver of my old resolve return, a fragile but determined energy. I decided to try, one more time, to share this with Richard. Perhaps, I thought foolishly, if I presented it calmly, with the information from the forum, he might finally listen. I found him in the kitchen, reading the newspaper. I approached him carefully, my heart thumping. I said, "Richard, I found something online last night, a medical forum. People are describing exactly what I've been going through. And I remembered that specialist, years ago, who said there was a little marker in my blood. Maybe it's connected." I held my breath, hoping for a different reaction this time, a moment of consideration. He lowered his newspaper slowly, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, a sigh. Not an angry sigh, but something far worse, a sigh of weary resignation, of profound, unshakable skepticism. He said, "Brenda, Dr. Google again? Honey, you have to stop fixating on this. You're just feeding your obsession. There's nothing wrong with you that a bit of fresh air and a better attitude wouldn't fix. His words, meant perhaps to be gently dismissive, landed like hammer blows. Obsession. Bad attitude. He still didn't see. He wouldn't see. The fragile hope I had nurtured overnight shattered. The light from that distant star was snuffed out, plunged back into darkness by his casual, unthinking cruelty. It was a brutal reminder that my reality, my suffering, was utterly invisible to him, to all of them. This attempt to share, this small act of reaching out, had only deepened my despair. Yet, paradoxically, his dismissal also solidified something within me. If he wouldn't believe me, if no one would, then I had to find the truth for myself. His words, intended to shut down my obsession, instead fueled a tiny, rebellious ember of conviction in my own mind. He might think I was crazy, but I knew what I felt. The flicker of doubt wasn't in their narrative anymore, it was in mine. Was I truly just imagining all this, as they so clearly believed? Or was there something terribly real happening to me, something they were too blind, too unwilling, or perhaps too scared to see? The forum, that half-forgotten blood test, these were not figments of my imagination. They were tangible, however small. And they whispered a different story than the one my family had written for me. The path forward remained shrouded in fog, but now, I felt a desperate, almost primal urge to find a way through it. Their disbelief was a prison, but that night, reading those posts, I glimpsed the possibility of a key. The problem was, the key was buried, and I was a prisoner with failing strength, accused by her own jailers of faking her desire for freedom. This small, almost insignificant flicker, this internal shift from complete despair to a desperate, quiet determination, was imperceptible to anyone else. To my family, I was still just Brenda, the hypochondriac. But inside, a seed of defiance had been planted. It was small, and the soil was barren, but it was there. Their continued dismissal, their refusal to even consider an alternative, was no longer just a source of pain, it was becoming a catalyst. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't let their version of my story be the final one. The truth, I sensed, was a sleeping giant, and I had just heard its first, faint stirrings. Have you ever held on to a truth that no one else seemed to recognize? A conviction that burned within you despite all external dismissal? It's a lonely path, but sometimes, it's the only one that leads out of the darkness. I'd love to hear where you're joining me from on this journey. Let me know your city or country in the comments below. And if my story resonates, consider subscribing, because the path to uncovering what was really happening was about to take an unexpected and terrifying turn. The months that followed Richard's dismissal of my online research were a slow, agonizing descent. Each day felt like wading through quicksand, the effort to simply exist becoming more monumental. The glimmers of hope from the medical forum and the memory of that old blood test were still there, but they were overshadowed by the crushing weight of my family's unyielding skepticism and my own rapidly deteriorating physical state. I grew weaker, the pain more constant, the fatigue an oppressive blanket I couldn't throw off. My world had shrunk to the confines of our house, and mostly, to my bedroom. I was a ghost in my own life, and my family, it seemed, had grown accustomed to my spectral presence, stepping around me with a mixture of impatience and resigned pity. The turning point, the moment that irrevocably shifted the trajectory of this nightmare, wasn't a conscious decision or a brave stand. It was a brutal, involuntary surrender of my body. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Richard was at his golf game, Jessica was busy with her children, and Tom was at work. The house was quiet, a silence that usually amplified my loneliness but today felt heavy, almost suffocating. I'd been feeling particularly unwell all morning, a deeper exhaustion than usual, a dizzying weakness that made the room tilt if I moved too quickly. I remember thinking I needed a glass of water. Such a simple task, yet it felt like a Herculean effort. I pushed myself up from the armchair where I'd been dozing fitfully, my limbs heavy, my head swimming. Each step towards the kitchen was a battle. The familiar floral pattern of the linoleum seemed to waver beneath my feet. I reached the counter, gripping its edge for support, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My vision started to tunnel, the edges blurring into a hazy gray. I fumbled for a glass, my hand shaking. And then, it happened. There was no warning, no dramatic prelude. One moment I was standing, albeit unsteadily, and the next, the world simply tilted and went black. I felt a strange, detached sensation of falling, a distant thud as my head connected with the cool, unforgiving surface of the kitchen floor. There was no pain, not immediately, just a profound, all-encompassing darkness and an eerie silence. I was on the floor, helpless, unable to move, unable to call out. The vibrant life I once knew, the bustling home, the loving family, it all felt a million miles away. Time lost all meaning. I drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the cold seeping into my bones from the linoleum, the unnatural angle of my body. Fragmented thoughts flickered through my mind. This is it. This is how it ends. Alone, disbelieved, on the kitchen floor. A bitter irony, considering how often I'd been accused of seeking attention. Now, truly in need, there was no one. The silence of the house pressed in, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator, a mundane soundtrack to my utter collapse. I don't know how long I lay there. It could have been an hour, it could have been several. Each passing minute felt like an eternity of helplessness. I tried to move, to lift a hand, to make a sound, but my body was a leaden weight, unresponsive to my commands. Fear, cold and sharp, began to pierce through the fog of my semi-consciousness. What if no one found me? What if this was where my story, my real, unacknowledged story of suffering, concluded? Then, distantly, I heard a sound. A key in the front door, footsteps. My son, Tom. He sometimes stopped by after work, unannounced, a small, lingering habit from when our family life felt more normal. His voice called out, "Mom? You home?" A wave of desperate relief washed over me, so potent it almost felt like pain. I tried to answer, but only a faint, raspy sound escaped my lips. His footsteps grew closer. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, initially just a silhouette against the brighter light of the hallway. He stopped short. I saw his posture change, stiffen. The casual ease vanished. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "Mom!" His voice was no longer skeptical or pitying, it was raw with shock, with a dawning horror that cut through my own dazed state. He rushed to my side, his face pale, his eyes wide with the fear I hadn't seen in them since he was a small child. He knelt beside me, his hands hovering, unsure what to do. "Mom, what happened? Can you hear me?" The concern in his voice was real, unfeigned, stripped bare of all the layers of disbelief that had built up over the preceding months. In that moment, lying broken on the kitchen floor, I saw not the accuser, but my son, terrified for his mother. It was a strange, grim kind of validation. It had taken this, my complete and utter physical collapse, for the facade to crack, for one of them to finally see beyond their narrative. He was on the phone immediately, his voice urgent as he spoke to the emergency dispatcher. The words collapsed, unresponsive, hit her head echoed in the small kitchen space. As he spoke, his eyes kept darting back to me, filled with a mixture of panic and a guilt so profound it was almost tangible. This wasn't the dramatic episode they had so casually dismissed my previous complaints as. This was real. This was undeniable. The wail of the ambulance siren, growing closer, was the sound of something irrevocably breaking, not just within me, but within the carefully constructed denial of my family. As the paramedics worked over me, a strange sense of detachment settled in. The pain was immense, my body felt shattered, but a part of my mind was strangely calm. This, I thought, this they cannot ignore. This they cannot call an act. The kitchen floor had become my unwilling stage, and my collapse, the undeniable climax of a drama they had refused to acknowledge. This was the catalyst. Not a discovery, not a confrontation, but a surrender forced upon me by a body that could take no more. It was the point of no return, the moment the whispers and accusations had to, at least for a while, fall silent in the face of stark, physical reality. The turning point wasn't a moment of strength, but of ultimate vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, in that terrifying collapse, lay the faintest, most unexpected chance for the truth to finally begin its slow, arduous journey to the surface. The question was, would it be too late? The jarring ride in the ambulance, the sterile urgency of the emergency room, it all passed in a blur of pain, hushed voices, and the beeping of machines. I was prodded, scanned, and questioned, though my ability to respond was minimal. The head injury from the fall, thankfully, was deemed minor, a concussion, some bruising, but it was clear to the medical staff that my collapse was a symptom of something far more significant. This wasn't just a simple faint. My body was screaming a truth that had long been silenced. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was in a place where my physical state was the primary focus, not my supposed psychological motivations. Tom stayed by my side, his earlier shock now settled into a quiet, anxious demeanor. He answered the doctor's preliminary questions, his voice subdued, recounting the timeline of my not feeling well with a new, hesitant inflection, as if hearing his own past dismissiveness with fresh, uncomfortable ears. Richard and Jessica arrived later, summoned by Tom. Their faces were a mixture of concern and, I thought, a defensive apprehension. They spoke in low tones to the ER doctor, and I caught snippets. "She's been very anxious. We thought it might be stress." Even now, faced with the undeniable reality of my hospitalization, the old narrative tried to resurface, a stubborn weed. But this time, things were different. I wasn't just telling them I felt unwell, my body had provided irrefutable evidence. The initial ER workup showed several abnormalities: an erratic heart rate, low blood pressure, markers of inflammation that couldn't be easily dismissed. I was admitted to the hospital for further observation and testing. It was during this admission that a new figure entered my story, Dr. Evelyn Chen, a neurologist assigned to my case due to the collapse and the ongoing, undiagnosed neurological symptoms I'd reported before, however vaguely they'd been recorded. Dr. Chen was younger than many of the specialists I'd seen previously, with a calm, focused intensity that was immediately reassuring. When she first came to my room, I was weak, my voice barely a whisper, but I tried to recount the long history of my symptoms, the profound fatigue, the migrating joint pain, the brain fog, the skin sensations. I braced myself for the familiar polite skepticism, the subtle redirection toward psychological causes. Instead, she listened. Really listened. She made eye contact, nodded thoughtfully, and asked clarifying questions that showed she was processing the information, not just waiting for me to finish. She reviewed my scant medical history, the notes from previous dismissive doctors. Then, crucially, I remembered to tell her, my voice raspy, about the vague autoimmune marker from years ago, the one I'd almost forgotten, the one Richard had scoffed at. A flicker of interest sparked in Dr. Chen's eyes. She said, "That's an interesting piece of information, Mrs. Miller. We'll definitely look into that." It was the first time a medical professional had validated that faint, desperate clue I'd clung to. Over the next few days, Dr. Chen ordered a comprehensive battery of tests, far more extensive than anything I'd undergone before. There were blood tests for obscure antibodies, nerve conduction studies, imaging scans. It was exhausting, and each procedure was a reminder of how ill I truly was, but it was also imbued with a fragile sense of hope. Someone was finally looking, truly looking, for answers. Richard and Jessica visited, their attitudes a strange mix. There was a surface level of concern, the requisite flowers and hushed conversations, but underneath, I still sensed a lingering doubt, a waiting for this to be explained away as something less serious, something perhaps still, somehow, my fault. During one of Jessica's visits, she sat by my bedside, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. She said, "Mom, are you sure you didn't just overdo it? Maybe you weren't eating properly." The implication was clear, still searching for a way to make this my failing, not a genuine, uncontrollable illness. I was too weak to argue, too tired to rehash the old, painful battles. I simply looked at her, and perhaps the depth of my weariness, the undeniable reality of the IV drip in my arm, gave her pause. She looked away, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. Dr. Shen, however, remained steadfast in her methodical investigation. She would visit daily, updating me in her calm, direct manner. She didn't offer false reassurances, but her commitment to finding an answer was a lifeline. She explained what each test was for, what she was looking for. It was a stark contrast to the years of being made to feel like a nuisance or a hypochondriac. Here, my symptoms were data points, pieces of a complex puzzle she was determined to solve. The process of investigation was slow, the waiting for results agonizing. Each day was a small battle, conserving energy, enduring the discomfort, clinging to the hope that Dr. Chin's efforts would yield something concrete. My family's presence was a complicated factor. While Tom seemed genuinely shaken and increasingly solicitous, Richard's visits felt more perfunctory, his impatience barely concealed. He'd talk about problems at his golf club or issues with the house, as if my critical illness was an inconvenient interruption to his normal life. The chasm between my reality and his seemed to widen with each passing day, even within the sterile confines of the hospital room. I started to piece together fragments of overheard conversations between the nurses, hushed discussions outside my door. Words like complex case, systemic, autoimmune panel. These were the words I had seen on those late-night forums, words that had once seemed like desperate grasp in the dark but now echoed with the potential of medical validation. The pursuit of truth was no longer just my solitary, desperate quest. It had been taken up by a professional, someone with the tools and the knowledge to uncover what lay hidden. This period of investigation was a crucible. It was terrifying to be so vulnerable, so dependent, but it was also the first time in years that I felt a flicker of agency, albeit a borrowed one. My body had forced their hand, and now, Dr. Chin was forcing the medical mystery into the light. The answers were coming, I could feel it. And with them, I sensed, would come a reckoning. The unraveling had begun, not just of my health, but potentially of the false narrative that had almost destroyed me. The question was, what would be left when everything was finally laid bare? The days in the hospital stretched into a week, then nearly two. The initial flurry of tests gave way to a period of anxious waiting. Dr. Chin would pop in, her expression calm but unreadable, saying some results were still pending, others required further analysis. My family's visits continued, each one a fresh reminder of the chasm between their perception and my reality. Richard remained distant, preoccupied. Jessica oscillated between moments of genuine concern and flashes of her old skepticism, as if half expecting me to suddenly sit up and declare it was all a misunderstanding. Only Tom seemed consistently, deeply troubled, his guilt a palpable presence in the room. He'd sit quietly, sometimes just holding my hand, his eyes full of unspoken apologies. Then came the day Dr. Shin walked into my room with a different air about her. She wasn't rushed, she pulled up a chair, her gaze direct and compassionate. My heart began to hammer. This was it. She had news. She started gently, explaining the complexity of the human immune system, how sometimes it could mistakenly attack the body it was designed to protect. She spoke of patterns in my blood work, of specific antibodies that had been identified, of the nerve conduction studies showing abnormalities. Each word was carefully chosen, precise. And then, she gave it a name. She said, "Mrs. Miller, based on all the clinical evidence, the progression of your symptoms, and the comprehensive test results, we have a definitive diagnosis. You have a condition called systemic sclerosis, often known as scleroderma. It's a rare, chronic, autoimmune disease that causes hardening and tightening of the skin and connective tissues, and it can also affect internal organs. The fatigue, the joint pain, the skin sensations, the issues you've described with swallowing at times, it all fits the profile of this particular variant type scleroderma." The word hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar, yet strangely, profoundly validating. It wasn't stress. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't all in my head. It was real. It had a name. A complex, serious, life-altering name. A wave of emotions washed over me, immense relief, so potent it brought tears to my eyes, but also a chilling fear. This wasn't a temporary ailment, it was chronic, progressive. But even the fear was secondary to the overwhelming vindication. I wasn't a hypochondriac. I wasn't a fraud. I was sick. Truly, demonstrably sick. Dr. Chin went on to explain the implications, the treatment options, mostly aimed at managing symptoms and slowing progression, as there was no cure. She spoke with honesty and empathy, answering my weak, raspy questions. For the first time in years, I felt seen, heard, believed. The medical truth was out. But as the initial relief began to settle, another, colder realization dawned. My family, my husband, my children, they hadn't just been ignorant, their disbelief had been a profound act of cruelty, of neglect. They had dismissed my suffering, trivialized my pain, and left me to navigate this terrifying illness alone, branded a liar. The initial discovery of the villain in my story was, therefore, not a single person but the collective entity of my family's denial, their selfishness. Their motive? It seemed, at first, to be simple inconvenience. My illness disrupted their lives, their expectations of me. It was easier to label me an attention seeker than to confront the messy, unpredictable reality of a chronically ill wife and mother. Richard wanted his active, healthy partner back, not a woman who was constantly tired and in pain. Jessica, overwhelmed with her own life, didn't want the added burden of a sick parent needing support. Tom, younger and more easily influenced, had simply followed their lead. But the unmasking didn't end there. While I was in a rehabilitation facility for a few weeks after my hospital discharge, trying to regain some strength and learn to manage my new diagnosis, my sister Linda came to help sort through some of the administrative chaos that had accumulated at my home. Linda had always been a quiet supporter, never fully buying into Richard's narrative about my dramatics. She was practical, no nonsense, and had a keen eye for detail. One afternoon, she called me, her voice tight with a controlled anger I rarely heard from her. She said, "Brenda, I've been going through some of the mail, the bills. There are things here you need to know." She described finding several overdue notices for joint accounts I had assumed Richard was managing and were in good standing. Then, the kicker, she'd found statements for a credit card in Richard's name only, a card I hadn't known existed. The charges were not for household expenses. They were for expensive dinners at restaurants in a nearby city, charges at a boutique hotel, jewelry. The dates often coincided with times he claimed to be working late or at a conference. The financial pressure Richard had occasionally alluded to, the pressure he perhaps used as a subconscious justification for his impatience with my mounting medical needs, wasn't just from my illness. It was, in significant part, due to his own secret spending, his clandestine life. My illness hadn't just been an inconvenience to his lifestyle, it had been a threat to the resources he was diverting elsewhere. His desire for me to be not sick suddenly took on a much darker, more selfish dimension. He hadn't just wanted to avoid the emotional labor of caring for an ill wife, he'd wanted to avoid any disruption to his deceptions, any claim on the funds he was siphoning off. The betrayal was staggering. It was one thing to be disbelieved, to be accused of faking an illness. It was another thing entirely to realize that this disbelief might have been, in part, a calculated smokescreen to hide his own deceit, his own infidelity. The villain in my story wasn't just a family blinded by selfishness, its chief architect was my husband, a man leading a double life, whose accusations against me served his own duplicitous ends. The why behind their cruelty was no longer just about avoiding inconvenience. For Richard, it had also been about self-preservation, about protecting his secrets. The diagnosis had given me a name for my physical suffering. Linda's discovery gave me a name for the source of so much of my emotional torment, Richard. His betrayal was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The shock was profound, but it was quickly followed by a chilling clarity. The pieces clicked into place, his increasing detachment, his impatience, his subtle sabotaging of my attempts to get medical help. It all made a terrible, twisted kind underscore of sense now. My illness wasn't just a burden to him, I was. And my faking it was a convenient narrative to justify his emotional and financial abandonment. The true villain was unmasked, and his motives were far uglier than I could have ever imagined. Lying in my bed at the rehabilitation center, the sterile environment a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within me, I felt a shift. The diagnosis of scleroderma had brought a strange, bittersweet validation. Linda's revelations about Richard's deceit, however, had ignited a different kind underscore of fire, a cold, hard anger, a deep, resonant fury that burned away the last vestiges of my despair and self-doubt. For years, I had been the victim, the one misunderstood, the one slowly fading under the weight of their accusations. No more. The knowledge of Richard's betrayal, layered on top of the family's collective dismissal, crystallized into a steely resolve. I would not just accept a quiet apology, if one ever came. I would not let them sweep years of cruelty and neglect under the rug now that my illness had an undeniable name. My mind, clearer than it had been in months despite the physical weakness, began to work with a focused intensity. I replayed scenes from the past few years, Richard's dismissive comments, Jessica's eye rolls, Tom's uncomfortable silence. Before, these memories had brought pain and confusion. Now, they brought a chilling clarity. Their actions weren't just born of ignorance, they were colored by selfishness, and in Richard's case, by active deception. He hadn't just failed to support me, he had, in a way, benefited from my illness being delegitimized, as it kept the focus off his own transgressions. The thought of revenge, in the traditional sense, didn't appeal. I had no desire for petty acts or emotional outbursts. My illness would take enough of my energy. I wouldn't waste more on theatrical confrontations that would ultimately leave me feeling as empty as they did. No, my plan for justice needed to be as undeniable as my diagnosis, as irrefutable as the bank statements Linda had found. It needed to be a quiet, methodical exposure of the truth, a mirror held up to their faces, reflecting not just my suffering, but their culpability. I envisioned a family meeting. Not in my home, which still felt tainted by years of unhappiness and accusation, nor in Richard's presence alone initially. It would be on neutral ground, at my sister Linda's house. She had been my steadfast, if quiet, ally, and her home represented a space of truth and support. I would wait until I was stronger, more physically capable of enduring what would undoubtedly be an emotionally charged encounter. I wasn't going to be the weeping, broken woman they had dismissed for so long. I would be calm, factual, armed not with accusations but with evidence. The plan formed with a stark simplicity. First, I would present Dr. Chen's official diagnostic report. A clear, concise summary of my condition, its severity, its chronic nature. Let them see, in black and white, the medical reality they had denied. No room for interpretation, no space for their "it's just stress" narrative. This would be for all of them, Richard, Jessica, and Tom. They all needed to confront the tangible proof of what they had dismissed. Then, the second, more personal blow, reserved primarily for Richard, though the children would witness it. After the medical facts were laid bare, I would present the evidence Linda had uncovered, copies of the overdue joint account notices showing his financial neglect, and the damning credit card statements detailing his secret expenditures, his clandestine trips, his gifts to someone else. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't scream. I would simply lay the papers on the table, letting the cold, hard facts speak for themselves. My voice would be steady, my gaze unwavering. My revenge wouldn't be about destroying them, though a part of me certainly felt they deserved a taste of the pain they had inflicted. It was about reclaiming my narrative, my dignity. It was about forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions, the depth of their betrayal. It was about moral justice, about ensuring they understood the full scope of the damage they had done, not just to my health, but to our family, to my trust, to my very sense of self. This wouldn't be a plea for understanding or an appeal for sympathy. It would be a quiet, dignified indictment. During my remaining weeks in rehab, this plan became my focus. Each small physical gain, each step towards regaining some independence, was fueled by this new, cold resolve. I would meticulously go over what I wanted to say, how I wanted to present the information. Linda, during her visits, became my confidant. She listened, offered quiet encouragement, and agreed to host the meeting when the time was right. She understood my need for this not to be a messy, emotional free-for-all, but a controlled, factual reckoning. The woman who had collapsed on the kitchen floor was slowly being replaced by someone else. Still physically frail, yes, and facing a daunting future with a serious illness, but emotionally, I was being forged into something stronger, something more resilient. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but it was now intertwined with a sense of purpose. I was no longer just a patient, a victim. I was preparing for a confrontation, not of anger, but of truth. The sword I was forging was not one of violence, but of undeniable, meticulously gathered facts. and I would wield it with the quiet precision of someone who had nothing left to lose, and everything, her truth, her dignity, to reclaim. The day of that meeting couldn't come soon enough. The weeks in rehabilitation crawled by, each day a small victory in the battle to reclaim some semblance of physical strength. My scleroderma was a relentless opponent, but the clarity of my purpose, the impending family meeting, acted as a potent fuel. With Linda's unwavering support, I focused on my physiotherapy, on relearning how to manage my daily life with the limitations my illness imposed. Every small improvement, every bit of energy I managed to conserve, was channeled towards that future confrontation. Linda, meanwhile, acted as my quiet intelligence gatherer, meticulously making copies of Richard's damning financial statements, organizing Dr. Chen's reports into a clear, undeniable dossier. We spoke often, refining the plan, ensuring every detail was considered. The day I was finally discharged from the rehab facility, I felt a mixture of trepidation and a grim, steely resolve. Going back to the house I had shared with Richard was out of the question. It felt like a tomb of bad memories. Linda had already prepared a room for me at her place, a sanctuary where I could continue to heal and prepare. It was from there, about a week after my discharge, that Linda made the calls. She spoke to Richard, then to Jessica, and finally to Tom. Her tone was neutral but firm. She said, "Brenda has some important news to share about her health, and she'd like to discuss it with all of you together." She suggested Sunday afternoon, at her house. I could only imagine their reactions. Richard, perhaps, would be irritated by the summons, expecting another round of what he considered my complaints. Jessica might have sighed, already mentally calculating how this would disrupt her weekend plans. Tom, I hoped, might feel a flicker of genuine concern, or at least curiosity, given what he had witnessed in the kitchen that fateful day. Whatever their initial thoughts, they all agreed to come. The stage was set. The days leading up to that Sunday were a blur of anxiety and focused preparation. I went over the documents with Linda one last time, my hands surprisingly steady as I arranged Dr. Chen's stark medical findings alongside the cold, hard proof of Richard's duplicity. I practiced what I would say, not a script to be memorized, but key phrases, a calm, factual tone I was determined to maintain. I needed to be composed, to present the information with a quiet authority that would brook no argument, no dismissal. This wasn't about emotional hysterics, this was about the undeniable weight of truth. Sleep was elusive the night before. My body ached with a familiar weariness, but my mind raced. Doubts, like insidious whispers, tried to creep in. What if they still didn't believe me? What if Richard managed to twist the narrative, to make me look like the villain for unearthing his secrets? What if my carefully constructed composure shattered under the pressure? There was a moment, deep in the small hours of the morning, when I almost reached for the phone to call Linda, to tell her I couldn't go through with it. The thought of facing them all, of reopening those wounds, of potentially enduring more of their disbelief, felt overwhelming. But then, I thought of the years of pain, of isolation, of being made to question my own sanity. I thought of the woman who had collapsed, alone and helpless, on the kitchen floor. That woman deserved this. She deserved to have her truth heard, her suffering acknowledged. The cold anger, the righteous fury, returned, pushing back the fear. This wasn't just for me, it was for every person who had ever been dismissed, disbelieved, or gaslighted by those who should have protected them. I steeled my resolve. I would see this through. Sunday afternoon arrived, draped in a pale, watery sunlight that did little to warm the chill in my heart. Linda had prepared tea and some light refreshments, a gesture of normalcy in what was bound to be an anything but normal gathering. I sat in an armchair she had positioned strategically, giving me a clear view of the others as they arrived, a position that felt subtly authoritative rather than vulnerable. I wore a simple, dignified dress, one that didn't overtly display my illness but also didn't try to hide the changes it had wrought in me. My hands rested on the small stack of papers in my lap. The doorbell rang. First Tom, his expression anxious, his eyes darting towards me with a mixture of concern and apprehension. He mumbled a quiet hello. Then Jessica, her demeanor more guarded, a polite, strained smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. She surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on me for a moment before flicking away. Finally, Richard. He entered with a forced air of casualness, a stark contrast to the tension that hummed in the room. He even attempted a small, jovial comment to Linda about the weather, a remark that fell flat in the heavy silence. They settled into the chairs Linda had arranged, forming a semicircle around me. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with years of resentment and misunderstanding. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. The tightrope I had been walking for weeks had led to this moment. One misstep, one faltering word, and the fragile power I had managed to gather could dissipate. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the papers beneath my fingertips. The execution of my plan, my quiet, dignified confrontation, was about to begin. The tension was almost a physical presence, pressing in on me, but beneath it, a core of ice-cold determination held firm. The silence in Linda's living room stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Richard shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as if preparing to take control of the narrative, as he always had. Jessica avoided my gaze, tracing patterns on the armrest of her chair. Tom looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of apprehension and something that might have been nascent remorse. I let the silence linger for another moment, allowing the weight of their unspoken expectations, their ingrained assumptions about me, to fill the space. Then, I began. My voice, when I finally spoke, was quieter than I had intended, but it was steady. There were no tremors, no quavers of emotion. I said, "Thank you all for coming. As Linda mentioned, I have some important information to share regarding my health." I paused, letting my gaze travel slowly from Richard to Jessica, then to Tom, meeting each of their eyes briefly before returning to the papers in my lap. I picked up the first document, a concise summary from Dr. Chen. I started, "Richard, Jessica, Tom, for several years, as you know, I have been unwell. I have described to you, many times, the fatigue, the pain, the other symptoms that have gradually taken over my life. Your collective response has been one of disbelief. You accused me of faking my illness, of seeking attention, of being a hypochondriac. My words were calm, factual, a simple statement of past events, yet they landed with the force of an indictment in the quiet room." Richard opened his mouth as if to interrupt, a defensive posture already forming, but I held up a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that nevertheless stopped him. I continued, "After my collapse, I underwent extensive testing at the hospital under the care of Dr. Evelyn Chen, a neurologist. She has provided a definitive diagnosis." I then proceeded to read key excerpts from Dr. Chen's report, my voice even and clear. I explained scleroderma in simple terms, a chronic, progressive autoimmune disease. I detailed how it attacks the body's own tissues, causing inflammation, hardening, and damage to skin, joints, and internal organs. I listed the specific symptoms Dr. Chen had confirmed were directly attributable to the disease: the debilitating fatigue, the chronic pain, the Raynaud's phenomenon, the early signs of internal organ involvement. As I spoke, I methodically passed out copies of Dr. Chen's summary to each of them. I watched their faces. Tom's brow furrowed in distress as he read, his earlier guilt deepening. Jessica's guarded expression began to crumble, replaced by a dawning confusion, then horror. She kept looking from the paper to me, as if trying to reconcile the woman she thought she knew with the stark medical facts. Richard, however, maintained a stoic, almost defiant facade, though I saw a muscle twitching in his jaw as he scanned the document. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the undeniable truth. When I finished reading the medical summary, I placed the paper back in my lap. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by a small, choked sound from Jessica. She whispered, her voice barely audible, "Scleroderma? But you said. It was just stress." Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrible, dawning understanding. I looked directly at her, my gaze unwavering but not unkind. I said, "Yes, Jessica. That is what you all chose to believe." It was, perhaps, easier than confronting the alternative. I let that sink in before turning my attention to Richard. His face was a mask, but I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. He was cornered by medical fact, something he couldn't easily dismiss or twist. And then, I moved to the second part of my agenda. My voice remained calm, but an edge of ice crept into it. I said, and while I was apparently faking it for attention, Richard, and while our joint finances were supposedly under strain due to my non-existent medical needs, you were quite busy yourself. I picked up the next set of papers, copies of the joint account statement showing overdue notices, followed by his personal credit card bills. I didn't read these aloud. Instead, I slid them across the coffee table towards him, one by one. The overdue notices. The credit card statement with its damning list of charges, intimate dinners for two at expensive restaurants in the city, weekend stays at boutique hotels, charges from a jeweler. Each page was a cold, hard piece of evidence of his secret life, his financial irresponsibility, his profound betrayal. I said, were these dinners for attention too, Richard? Or these hotel stays? Or was it simply easier for you to believe I was a liar, a drain on our resources, than to face the reality of your own deceptions, your own secret life? The color drained from Richard's face. His carefully constructed composure shattered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock, then a flash of anger, quickly followed by a desperate, cornered fear. He stared at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, no bluster, no easy denial forthcoming. The evidence was too clear, too damning. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she, too, glanced at the damning charges, the implications hitting her with full force. Tom just stared at his father, his expression one of utter disbelief and dawning disgust. The grand reveal was complete. No shouting, no hysterics, just the quiet, devastating weight of truth. I had laid out the evidence of my illness, and the evidence of his betrayal, side by side. The woman they had dismissed as a hypochondriac, an attention seeker, had just calmly, methodically, dismantled their entire narrative, exposing not only her own suffering but the ugly secrets that had festered beneath the surface of their denial. In front of everyone, I had reclaimed my story. The silence in the room was no longer just tense, it was thick with shame, with shock, with the undeniable, uncomfortable glare of exposed truth. The silence that followed my final, quiet question to Richard stretched for what felt like an eternity. It was a silence heavy with the weight of exposed lies, shattered illusions, and the dawning, horrifying comprehension of years of injustice. Richard sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent fury, the credit card statements lying on the coffee table before him like an accusation rendered in ink. He looked from the papers to me, then to his children, a trapped animal searching for an escape route where none existed. For once in his life, Richard Miller, the man who always had an answer, a deflection, a way to control the narrative, was utterly speechless. Jessica was the first to break. A sob escaped her, raw and ragged. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "Oh my God, Mom," she choked out between sobs. "Oh my God. What did we do? What did we do?" Her carefully constructed composure, her years of skepticism, had crumbled completely, replaced by a torrent of guilt and shame so profound it was painful to witness, even for me. She wasn't looking for excuses anymore, she was looking at the raw, ugly truth of her own complicity. Tom, who had been staring at his father with an expression of growing revulsion, finally turned to me. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a deep, aching remorse. He didn't try to make excuses. He simply said, "Mom, I am so sorry." There are no words. We were monsters. His voice was thick with emotion, his apology unreserved, unequivocal. It was the first genuine admission of wrongdoing I had heard from any of them in years, and though it couldn't erase the past, it landed with a small measure of bitter validation. Richard, finally, seemed to find his voice, though it was hoarse, laced with a desperate attempt to regain some control. "Brenda, this is a misunderstanding. Those expenses. There are explanations." But his words lacked conviction. The evidence was too stark, too clear. His attempted bluster sounded hollow even to his own ears, I suspected. He looked at Jessica, then at Tom, perhaps seeking an ally, but found none. Their eyes were fixed on him, cold and disillusioned. My sister Linda, who had remained a quiet, supportive presence throughout, then spoke, her voice calm but firm. Explanations, Richard. Explanations for years of neglecting Brenda's health. Explanations for systematically deceiving her, for carrying on a secret life while she suffered? I think Brenda has laid out the facts quite clearly. Her words, delivered without rancor but with an undeniable authority, cut through Richard's feeble attempts at deflection. I looked at Richard, my expression unyielding. I said, "No, Richard. There are no misunderstandings. There is only the truth, which you have avoided for a very long time. A truth I was forced to live with in silence, while you and, yes, our children, chose to believe a convenient lie." I paused, then delivered the final, quiet blow. "As for us, Richard, there is nothing left to misunderstand. I will be filing for divorce." The word divorce hung in the air, stark and final. Jessica let out another small cry. Richard stared at me, his face ashen. Perhaps, even through all his deceit, he had never imagined it would come to this, that the quiet, accommodating Brenda he had taken for granted for so long would find the strength to sever the ties completely. But the woman he had known was gone, replaced by someone forged in the fires of his betrayal and her own suffering. The aftermath of the confrontation was a study in contrasting reactions. Jessica, once her initial torrent of tears subsided, seemed consumed by a desperate need to atone. She kept repeating, "I didn't know, Mom. I truly didn't know how bad it was. I was so selfish, so wrapped up in my own problems." Her apologies felt genuine, born of a deep, horrifying realization of her own cruelty. Tom remained largely silent, his shame a heavy cloak, but his eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a profound sorrow and a plea for a forgiveness I wasn't yet ready to offer. Richard, however, after the initial shock, retreated into a sullen, defensive silence. He made no attempt to apologize, no effort to explain his actions further. He simply sat there, a diminished figure, the architect of his own downfall, exposed and stripped of his authority, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The man who had dismissed my pain with such casual arrogance was now facing the public ruin of his reputation within his own family. As they prepared to leave Linda's house later that afternoon, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken emotions. Jessica lingered, asking if there was anything at all, she could do. I told her, gently but firmly, that what I needed most was time and space. Tom gave me a brief, awkward hug, whispering another "I'm sorry" before quickly retreating. Richard left without a word, without even a backward glance, the damning papers still on Linda's coffee table. In the days and weeks that followed, the repercussions continued. The news of my diagnosis and the impending divorce sent ripples through our small circle of acquaintances. Some who had sided with Richard and Jessica, who had whispered about my dramatics, now looked away in shame when they saw me or Linda. Others offered tentative, awkward apologies. The truth, once unleashed, had a way of reordering perceptions, of forcing a reevaluation of past judgments. The immediate consequence for Richard was a profound isolation. His children, disgusted by his deceit and their own past blindness, distanced themselves from him. His carefully curated image as a devoted husband and family man was shattered. For Jessica and Tom, the consequence was a heavy burden of guilt, a painful reckoning with their own actions. For me, the consequence was a strange, quiet emptiness. The battle was over, the truth was out, but the victory was bittersweet. I had my vindication, but I had lost the family I thought I had. The confrontation had brought exposure and a degree of justice, but the path to healing, I knew, would be long and arduous. The shame, the shock, the attempts at reconciliation, these were now their burdens to carry. Mine was to finally begin to heal. The months following that confrontation at Linda's house were a period of profound, quiet transformation. It wasn't a sudden phoenix rising from the ashes moment, it was slower, more akin to the painstaking work of clearing a field that had been choked with weeds and debris for years. The divorce proceedings with Richard moved forward with a grim efficiency. He offered little resistance, perhaps aware that any attempt to contest would only bring further scrutiny upon his deceptions. The comfortable suburban home we had shared, once a symbol of our life together, now felt like a monument to lies. I had no desire to return there. With my share of the settlement and Linda's steadfast help, I found a small, manageable apartment in a quieter part of town, a blank canvas on which to sketch a new, albeit uncertain, future. Physically, managing scleroderma was, and continues to be, a daily challenge. Dr. Shin became my trusted partner in navigating its complexities. There were good days and bad days, periods of relative stability punctuated by flare-ups that left me exhausted and in pain. But now, there was a crucial difference. I was no longer fighting this battle alone and disbelieved. I had a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and a medical team that took my suffering seriously. The simple act of being believed, of having my reality validated, was in itself a powerful form of medicine for the soul, if not a cure for the body. Emotionally, the journey was more complex. The anger towards Richard settled into a kind underscore of weary resignation. He was a closed chapter, a painful lesson in misplaced trust. The hurt inflicted by Jessica and Tom was a different matter. Their apologies, particularly Tom's immediate and unreserved remorse and Jessica's tearful, repeated attempts to make amends, had chipped away at the wall I had built around my heart. It wasn't easy. The echoes of their past dismissiveness, their casual cruelty, still resonated. But I also saw their genuine anguish, their struggle to come to terms with the harm they had caused. Jessica, especially, was relentless in her efforts to atone. She started by simply showing up, not with demands or expectations, but with offers of practical help. She'd drive me to doctor's appointments, pick up groceries, or just sit with me quietly if I was having a bad day. She enrolled in therapy, trying to understand her own past behavior, her willingness to accept her father's narrative without question. She never asked for forgiveness directly, but her actions spoke volumes. She was learning to see me, truly see me, perhaps for the first time as an individual with her own struggles, not just as mom, the endlessly capable figure she had taken for granted. Tom, too, made efforts to reconnect, albeit in his own quieter way. He'd call regularly, sharing small details about his life, tentatively rebuilding the bridges his past actions had burned. He listened more than he spoke, his shame still evident, but his desire to mend our fractured relationship was clear. There were no grand gestures, just a consistent, gentle presence that slowly began to ease the rawness of my pain. I realized that I wasn't the same woman they had tried to break. The Brenda who had prided herself on being the family anchor, the one who begged for everyone, who smoothed over every conflict, was gone. In her place was someone quieter, more introspective, certainly more cautious. The ordeal had stripped away a certain naivete, a trusting openness that I knew would never fully return. But it had also uncovered a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I had walked through fire, faced down my accusers, and emerged, not unscathed, but whole. My spirit, though battered, was not broken. One afternoon, months after the confrontation, I was sitting in my new, sunny living room, looking out at the small balcony where I was attempting to grow a few herbs. I received an email from an online forum I joined for scleroderma patients, not the one that had first sparked my investigation, but a more formal support network Dr. Chin had recommended. They were looking for someone to help moderate a small, newly formed group for recently diagnosed individuals, someone who understood the shock and confusion of navigating a new, complex diagnosis. Without much conscious thought, I found myself typing a reply, offering my assistance. The idea of using my experience, my painful journey, to help others who were just starting theirs, resonated deeply. It felt like a way to transform my suffering into something purposeful. The woman who had been accused of faking an illness for attention was now quietly stepping into a role where her lived experience, her hard-won knowledge, could genuinely help others. This, I realized, was part of my transformation. My voice, once silenced by disbelief, could now be a source of comfort and guidance. The reflection in the mirror was different now. The lines of pain and worry were etched more deeply, but my eyes held a new clarity, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. I was no longer defined by my family's false accusations, nor solely by my illness. I was defining myself on my own terms. I had lost the family I thought I had, the life I had meticulously built, but in that loss, I had found a different kind of freedom, a more authentic sense of self. I was scarred, yes, but I was also, in a strange and profound way, more truly myself than I had been in years. The phoenix hadn't just risen, she was learning to navigate a new sky, with new wings. Years have passed since that tumultuous period, since the day I laid the truth bare in Linda's living room. I am in my early 60s now, living quietly in my sunlit apartment. The rhythm of my life is dictated, in part, by the ebbs and flows of scleroderma. There are days when the fatigue is a leaden cloak, when my joints ache with a fiery intensity, and the simple act of buttoning a shirt is a monumental effort. But there are also days of relative ease, days when I can tend to my small balcony garden, lose myself in a good book, or connect with the members of the online support group I now help facilitate. This is my new normal, a life reconfigured around the realities of chronic illness, but also around a hard-won peace. The scars remain, of course. They are not just physical, etched onto my skin by a relentless disease, but emotional too, reminders of the betrayal, the disbelief, the profound loneliness I endured. But these scars no longer define me. They are part of my story, yes, a testament to what I survived, but they are not the entirety of who I am. I have learned to live with them, to acknowledge their presence without letting them overshadow the quiet joy I now find in small, everyday moments. My relationship with Jessica and Tom has slowly, cautiously healed. It's not the same as it once was. A certain innocence, a blind trust, was irrevocably lost. But in its place, something more mature, more honest, has grown. Jessica is a constant, supportive presence in my life. She understands my physical limitations without pity, offering practical help and, more importantly, a listening ear. We talk, really talk, in a way we never did before. She has shared her own struggles in therapy, her journey to understand her past actions, and in her vulnerability, I have found a way to slowly, tentatively, forgive. Not for her sake, entirely, but for my own, because forgiveness, I've learned, is about releasing a burden, not excusing a wrong. Tom, too, has found his way back. He visits regularly, his quiet presence a comfort. He shares his life with me, seeks my advice, and often just sits with me, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we are rebuilding, brick by painstaking brick. He rarely speaks of the past, but his actions, his consistent care and respect, speak louder than any words of apology could. He, like Jessica, has had to confront his own part in my suffering, and he has emerged from it a more thoughtful, empathetic man. Richard is a distant figure, largely absent from my life and, from what I hear, increasingly isolated from his children as well. There has been no grand apology from him, no moment of profound remorse that I am aware of. And that, I have come to accept, is his burden to carry, not mine. He no longer has any power over me. The divorce was a clean break, a severing of ties that had become toxic and unsustainable. My peace of mind, my emotional well-being, no longer depends on his validation or his understanding. I have found my own. The online support group has become a significant part of my life. Sharing my story, listening to others, offering a word of encouragement or a piece of practical advice based on my own experiences, it has given me a sense of purpose that I never expected. To know that my suffering, my journey through the darkness of disbelief and misdiagnosis, can now serve as a beacon for others, can help them feel less alone, less afraid, is a profound gift. They said I was faking for attention. Well, now I have attention, the attention of people who truly understand, who truly see me. And this time, it is on my terms, for a truth that extends far beyond my own story. I don't pretend that life is easy. Living with a chronic, progressive illness is a constant negotiation, a daily act of courage and resilience. But I face it now with open eyes, with a strength I didn't know I possessed until it was tested to its limits. I have learned to advocate for myself, to trust my own body, to seek out compassionate and knowledgeable medical care. I have learned the importance of boundaries, the necessity of surrounding myself with people who uplift and support me, not those who diminish or doubt me. Looking back, the woman who collapsed on the kitchen floor seems like a distant echo. She was broken, terrified, alone. But from that brokenness, something new was forged. A woman who found her voice, who fought for her truth, who reclaimed her dignity against overwhelming odds. My story is not one of effortless triumph, but of gritty survival, of the enduring power of the human spirit to seek light even in the deepest darkness. The satisfaction I feel now is not the fiery thrill of revenge, but the quiet, steady warmth of justice served, of truth acknowledged. It's the peace of knowing that I am seen, I am believed, and I am, finally, free. Free from the weight of false accusations, free from the prison of others' disbelief, free to live the remainder of my life, however challenging it may be, with authenticity and a quiet, unshakable sense of self. My story is my own again. And that, perhaps, is the greatest vindication of all. This journey has been one of the hardest of my life, but sharing it, I hope, might help someone else feel less alone in their own struggles. If my story has touched you, if you've ever faced disbelief or fought for your own truth, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel or give this video a like. And I'm always moved to know where these stories reach. Please feel free to share your city or country in the comments below. Thank you for listening.